Happy Wednesday. Thank you all for joining. We're super excited to dive right in with our lovely guest, Michelle Vazzana. We'll give folks a couple minutes to trickle in. As you all know, I love to start things off with a fun icebreaker. And since we are in autumn in this part of the world in North America, I'd love to know, Michelle, what was your highlight this summer?
So my highlight was a trip to Spain. My husband and I went to the south of Spain to a town called Estepona, right on the Mediterranean, and it was lovely. I'd never been, but I can't wait to go back. So that was a huge highlight.
Oh, I love that. I was just
Yeah.
telling Michelle, I'm going to Spain at the end of the month for a couple of days, and I'm going to Barcelona and Mallorca. So if anyone has or is in Spain calling in, definitely mention that in the chat. And we also want to know where you're calling in from. If you're calling in from North America, we've also got folks from Cape Copenhagen one time. So we definitely want to see where our MSP members are calling in from. So definitely leverage the chat. But without further ado, we're super excited to dive right into the content today. We're going to talk about the truth about sales agility, separating fact from fiction, with the one and only Michelle Vazzana from Vantage Point Performance. But before we talk about the content, today's event is brought to you by the team at Modern Sales Pros. For those of you who are not familiar, hello, my name is Angelica. I'm one of the community event managers at MSP. And MSP is the world's largest and highest quality community for those in sales management, sales leadership, sales and revenue operations, sales enablement, aka our modern sales pros. Our mission is to create an environment for our members to answer questions they struggle to solve on their own and help them to see around corners they may not know about. We do this through live sessions like the one you're at today, our online forum, our quarterly summits, which I'll talk about in the next slide. As well, we're starting to get back into in-person events. So if you were in the SF Bay Area yesterday, you know that MSP hosted an event at De La Rosa for Dreamforce Happy Hour. If you were there, definitely drop in the chat to say hello that you were there and said hello to the team. But it was so well received and a lot of people came out. So stay tuned for more in-person events in a city near you. Might come up in the next few months. For those who just are new to the team or new to the squad of MSP, rest assured you will be joining the community at the end of the event and you'll have access to all of our cool resources. Now, speaking of our summit, super excited to talk about our summit that's happening next month on October 11th to the 13th. We pulled together 24 events of amazing content and speakers. You'll hear from CEO of Zoom Info, Gainsight, Cowboy Ventures, Winning by Design, as well as sales leaders at Lattice, Pendo, Outreach, Atrium, and more. I'll actually drop the URL link to register if you haven't got your free pass. It's going to be an amazing event, so definitely look at the chat. I just dropped the registration link, so sign up today to get access to this amazing content. Now, speaking of content, don't worry if you are unable to, if you have a friend or colleague that was unable to see Michelle talk about her content live, don't worry, this event is going to be recorded. As well, if you have any questions for Michelle, please use the Q&A panel function at the top right-hand corner. You'll see chat, poll, Q&A. Please drop your Q&A in the Q&A function, or you can definitely drop it in the chat, and Michelle and I will get to it at the end of the event. And her deck will be featured on our MSP previous event page at the end of the day. So she's going to show us amazing research, amazing content. So rest assured, you will have a copy of her deck. Now, enough about MSP and overall housekeeping notes. I'm actually going to pass it off to Michelle to talk about the sponsor today, which is Vantage Point, and then do an introduction about herself.
Thanks, Angelica. I'd love to share my screen. I don't see the little icon yet. Not yet. Let's see. Okay, here we go. Okay, so I am with Vantage Point Performance. Thrilled to be here. We are an organization that specializes in sales enablement, particularly sales enablement related to salesforce agility. So today we're going to share a significant amount of research around sales agility, what we've learned, what it means for you as a practitioner, as a seller, as a manager, as you give your best effort to achieve your goal. So this is a pretty hot topic. this idea of sales agility. And so I'd like to start with a little bit of a definition. I mean, what is sales agility anyway? So agility is the ability to adapt behavior based on changes in the situation an individual is facing. And this is not specific to sales, right? Agility finds its way into many, many domains, but today we're talking about sales. So there's also a term being bandied about called situational fluency. Sales agility, situational fluency, they all kind of mean the same thing when it comes to sales. And situational fluency is the ability to assess and make sense of the situation a seller is facing, select the optimal path forward, execute that path, and continually monitor impact. So it's this ability to figure out what you're facing, make decisions, execute and act on those decisions, and then determine the effectiveness of those decisions. So why is agility so important in today's marketplace? It might sound like a silly question after we've all lived through the last couple of years, right? Things have changed faster than any of us could have imagined, and we've had to find ourselves adjusting and adapting in ways that we could never have foreseen prior to some of the things that we faced. So there are some other researchers out there that are doing some really interesting research that really points to continued interest and necessity around sales agility. You've probably all heard of Gartner, very large research organization. They've done a lot of research around how salespeople share information with their customers, because a lot has changed in the landscape around how customers access information. And what Gartner has discovered is that customers are facing too much information. They have access to far more information than they could really ever use effectively. To make matters worse, a lot of this information is conflicting. So they may hear one thing from one company and something very different from another company. Both may be highly credible, however, they appear to be conflicting. And what happens is this overabundance of information, particularly conflicting information, makes it hard for our buyers to make trade-offs, right, to make better decisions. And what happens is it reduces the chances of making a viable sale for sellers by up to 66%. So that's really not very good news. But there is some good news in this story. And the good news is that Gartner also discovered that there's 3 very discrete ways that sellers share information with their buyers, and they're not equally effective. The first way is what they call a giver. And the giver is a seller who provides copious amounts of information, is very responsive to customer requests, and their opinion is more is better, right? I want to make sure I give everything I possibly can to my customer so they can then use that information to make better decisions. Well, then we have the teller, and the teller is just the opposite of the giver. The teller forms a very specific opinion and shares only the information relevant to that opinion with their customers and prospects. Think challenger sale, right? Taking charge, taking control. So we've got the giver who shares a lot of information, the teller who shares actually a much smaller amount of information, and then we have the sense maker who really balances what they bring to the party and what the customer is actually experiencing in the marketplace. You might imagine that this sense maker is by far the most effective of any of these 3 types of communicators as it relates to sales. So we're going to use this opportunity to help you, our viewers, make sense of this idea of sales agility. Because sales agility, like many other topics, there's a lot of information available in the marketplace, particularly the sales enablement marketplace. Much of this does conflict, and it makes it a little bit challenging for consumers of sales enablement solutions to really kind of sort out, what is truth and what is fiction. And so, again, the goal of this session is to not only share research with you, but help you make sense of what you encounter in the marketplace when you encounter a provider that's talking about sales agility. So I'm going to give you the punchline about sales agility, and then I'm going to systematically unpack the research that gets us to that punchline. So what we discovered over 14 years and many studies of research is agility is not a one-size-fits-all affair. In fact, there are 3 distinct yet related levels of sales agility within the sales force. The first level that we uncovered was called organizational agility, and this is about linking sales activities with organizational results. I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. There's also situational sales agility, which is about teasing out the differences between different buying situations and then determining which strategy amongst multiple strategies is most effective in a given buying situation. But then there's this other level, this foundational level, that really gets into buyer psychology and the buying journey. So this is really the punchline of what all of this research over all of these years has uncovered. And we're going to unpack each of these sort of step by step. But before we do that, because the goal of this is a sense-making goal, we're going to share with you some of the common yet potentially misleading perspectives that you will encounter in the sales enablement marketplace as it relates to sales agility. The first one of these is that sales agility is all about understanding and responding to the buyer's position within their buying process or buying journey. The other perspective is that agile selling is synonymous with agile software development. Neither one of these are accurate. Some of them are somewhat accurate, others are not at all, and we'll share that detail with you again throughout this webcast. So let's start with the research into organizational agility. And this was a series of studies conducted by Vantage Point and published in our best-selling books, Cracking the Sales Management Code and Crushing Quota. And the question we sought to answer was, how does agility impact sales management and coaching? And one of the questions is, when it relates to sales metrics, what do we use to measure and manage the sales force? And the answer to that is, well, it depends. There really is no one-size-fits-all approach as it relates to measuring and managing the sales force. Which results should we track? Which objectives? Which activities? Well, it depends. It depends on which business results you're targeting, which sales objectives or KPIs are necessary to achieve those results, and finally, which sales activities must be executed consistently well to achieve those sales objectives and KPIs. And this specific research study is published in our book, Cracking the Sales Management Code. So we know that there's not one size fits all as it relates to sales metrics. What about coaching? How is sales coaching impacted by agility and how does it show up? Well, there's another study that we did that's actually published in Crushing Quota, where we explored 3 different types of coaching that are highly prevalent in the marketplace, in sales training programs, in books that you can read. And these 3 types of coaching are capability coaching, think coaching to skills or to competencies, outcome coaching, coaching to results or, scrubbing and managing the pipeline, and finally, coaching to activities, sort of the lifeblood of what sellers do day in and day out to sell more stuff. And so when we went into this research project, we had a hypothesis that coaching to capabilities would be among the highest impact of any of the types of coaching that we studied. And we were actually quite shocked to find out that coaching to capabilities only had about a 2% impact on the variation in quota attainment. So almost negligible. And we were stunned by that. And I'll tell you more about that in just a minute. The second type of coaching, outcome coaching, think forecasting, pipeline scrubbing, only accounted for about 10% of the variance in quota attainment. It still didn't reach statistical significance. Activity coaching was the only type of coaching in our study that was positively and significantly related to quota attainment. So of these 3 types, clearly activity coaching was the clear winner. So when you put together all of these studies that we've done around measuring and managing the sales force, coaching, effective coaching to drive quota attainment, ultimately all of those studies resulted in a very powerful decision-making framework that represents organizational sales agility, meaning we want to make sure that frontline sales activities are highly related to organizational goals and objectives. And this decision-making framework consisted of aligning activities to results, ensuring that consistent coaching aligns to high-impact activities, and then monitoring leading indicators to reflect progress, and then making adjustments as needed if the progress is not being made. So that was our research into organizational agility and sales management and coaching practices, which forms the basis of this decision-making framework for organizational agility. But of course, we didn't stop there. The next series of studies on sales agility originated out of the Florida State University Sales Institute, which is why you see their logo there. There's a gentleman named Dr. Lef Bonney who led the research team that did these original studies. So these studies were originally designed to determine, is there one best sales methodology? If so, what is it? Do high performers adapt to the situation they face? Or do they use a one-size-fits-all approach? And if they do adapt, does that actually impact win rates in a positive way? So these were originally conducted by the Florida State University Sales Institute. They have since been validated and extended by VantagePoint as well. So here's a punchline on what these researchers at FSU found, which was quite shocking and innovative at the time. They found that each salesperson, or any salesperson in any sales force, faces between 4 and 6 unique buying situations. Even organizations within the same industry will face different buying situations. So it's not a one-size-fits-all affair. Buying situations vary. The other thing they found is that high-performing salespeople actually exhibit 4 patterns of sales behavior or 4 sales strategies, not one: consultative, financial, disruptive, and competitive. And the final point, which was really interesting here, is that the highest performing sellers adapt. They do not stick to one specific approach. The only people in the organization that stick to a one-size-fits-all are average and low performers. And typically, it's the sales approach they've been trained to execute. So think about the implications of that. If we train, say, our sellers on, say, disruptive or challenger selling, basically what that means is that only works in roughly 25% of the situations that the sellers face. And if they use that in every situation, they're only going to succeed about 25% of the time. That's a little bit shocking and a little bit problematic when you think about sales enablement efforts, because most organizations are really driving for consistency. They're driving for standardization. And Gartner also discovered that many of these attempts at standardization are tying the hands of salespeople and basically getting in the way or prohibiting them from being agile in the moment and being situationally aware. So pretty interesting findings. Again, they've been validated by VantagePoint, and we'll talk about how we extended those studies as well. So go back to some additional research. When FSU did the research around sales agility, they studied over 27 buying factors. And at VantagePoint, we look to take really good research and operationalize that research so that every salesperson, every sales manager can not only learn it, but then execute it effectively. It can't be too complex and it can't be too hard. So we wanted to know, of all these many, many buying factors, are there patterns in these buying factors? Are there things we can learn to simplify this idea and make it more executable? And what we learned through additional research is that all of these buying factors basically fit into 5 categories. They fit into the categories of problem awareness, how well does the buyer know the problem, competitive landscape, who's competing and in what way, customer dynamics, who's involved, how are they involved, buying stage or buying process, at what point along that buying process was the buyer when the seller engaged with them, and then solution definition. What is the buyer's definition of their ideal solution? So we took something that was highly complex, these huge amount of buying factors, and through additional research, we're able to narrow that down to 5 manageable categories of buying factors that matter to our buyers. And when we take a look at the decision-making framework that we developed, building on the Florida State University research and the additional research that VantagePoint did to validate and extend that research, we came up with a very powerful decision-making framework for situational sales agility. So sellers who are the most agile, they assess the buying situation, they assess the buying factors, and they make sense of those buying factors to get a clear picture of the buying situation they face. They then choose which amongst these 4 sales strategies is the most aligned to the buying situation, and then they execute the tactics within that particular strategy they've selected. They then monitor buyer reactions, obtaining feedback to determine how is the buyer responding to my approach, what changes am I seeing in the buying situation. So that forms our middle layer of sales agility, which we call situational sales agility. But we didn't stop there. We saw some really interesting things coming out of the data, which caused us to ask more questions. And we wanted to learn a little bit more about the buying factors. First of all, not only how do they work together, but are there certain buying factors that have an outsized influence on the buying situation over others? We also wanted to know, are these 4 sales strategies of consultative, financial, disruptive, and competitive, are they really that discrete, or are there nuances? Are there relationships that we haven't yet uncovered? And what we found is, and we're going to go back for just a moment before we get into the findings, but I'm going to go back to one of our perspectives on sales agility that was inadequate. And that was the perspective that situational fluency and or sales agility is about flexing to the buyer's position in their buying journey. And what we found in our research is that that's actually true, but it's not the whole story. Of course, you have to flex to the buyer's position within their buying journey. But that buying factor was significant in every buying situation that we encountered when we studied over 4,000 deals. So buying stage of the buying factors had an outsized influence on the buying situations. And again, it was only one of many, but it had an outsized influence. And so over time, what we learned is that there's this level of sales agility that precedes this idea of situational agility. And what we also know is when we took a look at how these 4 sales strategies work together, are they as discrete as we thought? What we found is actually, no, they're not as discrete as we thought. There's a high correlation between the tactics within consultative selling and the tactics within the other 3 strategies. We also learned that consultative selling, the tactics within consultative selling are heavily used regardless of the primary strategy selected by the seller. So for example, if the seller said a disruptive or challenging strategy was their primary strategy, we still saw a high incidence of consultative tactics utilized within that opportunity. So consultative isn't just one of the 4, it actually forms the basis for the other 3 and is used heavily in all deals, regardless of the primary strategy chosen, whether it was consultative, disruptive, competitive, or financial. We also learned that buying stage was had an outsized influence on the buying situations, much more so than any other factor. We also learned that when sellers engage early in the buyer's journey, the use of consultative tactics was 6 times higher than it was when they engaged late in the buyer's journey. So those were some really interesting findings when we took a little closer look under the hood of sales agility. We also took a look at, of the 3 primary tactics within consultative selling, which of these tactics had the strongest correlation to wins. And our hypothesis, as a researcher, you have to be willing to be wrong. And we are wrong a lot. But when we're wrong, it's still interesting, and we learn from that. So our hypothesis was that the uncovered needs tactic would have the highest impact on wins of any of these 3 tactics. But we were wrong. Obtaining commitment was the tactic that had the highest impact on wins. And not just obtaining commitment, but obtaining incremental wins along the buying journey. So the punchline here is that buying stage is foundational to agility. You can't go to situational agility and figure out buying situations without understanding the buying journey. We also found that consultative selling is not just one of the 4, it really drives everything and is foundational to all forms of agility. So what we did based on this research is we were able to develop this foundational agility framework where sellers assess the buying situation, the buyer's stage within that buying situation. They choose the best path forward based on what the buyer motivators are at that stage and the buyer's objectives at that stage, and they flex accordingly. And then they execute sales conversations that are relevant to that stage of the buyer's journey, again, obtaining feedback and monitoring buyer reactions. So this research and this framework form the basis of this final level of sales agility that we call foundational sales agility. So when we put all that together, we have organizational agility, which is all about aligning frontline sales execution with organizational goals and objectives. Situational sales agility, which helps sellers assess and make sense of their buying situation, select amongst multiple sales strategies, and then execute the tactics within that strategy. And we have foundational agility, which helps sellers assess the buyer's location within their buying journey, understanding buyer psychology and how buyer motivators change as they navigate that journey, plan and execute accordingly. And again, this forms the basis of all three of these levels of sales agility. You've heard me say a lot about decision making. And if you take a look at these frameworks for organizational, situational, and foundational agility, what's probably becoming abundantly apparent is that these are not procedural frameworks. These are decision-making frameworks. And they're decision-making frameworks because the most agile salespeople and the most agile sales managers are the best decision makers. They have criteria they use to make decisions, and then they make those decisions, monitoring the impact, and then adjusting those decisions as needed. So it's about teaching people to be agile, not just develop a procedural framework for being agile. So now we're going to go back to the second misleading perspective on sales agility. And this one is becoming more and more prevalent and problematic in the sales enablement marketplace. And that is that sales agility is similar to and benefits from the principles of agile software development. There's even been books written about this. And as researchers, we're quite curious about some of the other perspectives in the marketplace. And then we really dig under the hood to find out, is there really merit to that? One of the reasons that this is becoming a popular perspective is because agile software development is quite popular. The whole idea of agile is very prevalent, especially in the software marketplace. And when we think about sales agility and we think about agile software development, tying those together is intuitively appealing, but almost impossible to prove or disprove. So it's actually a quite clever perspective, but it doesn't really hold water. So when you think about agile software development, the most popular methodology in agile software development is called Scrum, the Scrum methodology. And the Scrum methodology involves these series of small individual sprints along the software development life cycle. Well, that sounds interesting. I mean, after all, we did some research that said incremental commitment is really important. So you can see why it's intuitively appealing. But when we look a little deeper into agile software development, what we learn is that these agile sprints are small pieces of code developed tiny portions of the overall project. There's many different developers pursuing these sprints concurrently, but on different topics. So it's kind of just the opposite of a sales team coming together. These agile sprinters are separating, doing their own little thing without talking to anybody else until their sprint is done. So it's basically just the opposite of how selling works, because if you have a sales team, say it's a salesperson, it might be a systems engineer, it might be some sort of implementation person. They're all sort of marching to the same tune as they pursue the sale or the opportunity. Whereas agile software development is really just the opposite. It's separating things out and letting different people attend to them. But the other most important difference is that agile software development is completely internal to the developer's environment. Agile selling and buying situations are completely external to the seller's environment. So when we think about these sprints and we think about internal versus external, when you really look into it and really understand what agile software development is, you realize very quickly that it's nothing like sales agility. Again, it's a clever perspective, but it really doesn't hold well under scrutiny. So all this talk about sales agility, all the different levels of sales agility, the perspectives on sales agility, oftentimes the biggest question our clients and prospects have is, well, how do you master sales agility? How do you actually become an agile seller? And interestingly enough, when this research originally took place, there was no one in the sales training marketplace that was actually training sales agility. So the researchers had to look outside of the domain of sales to learn, how do domains that have to train agility into the position, how do they do it? Are there certain pillars or components of agility that are common to these different domains? And so the researchers looked outside of sales. They looked at the military, they looked at professional sports, and they looked at first responders. And what they found is that there are some common pillars across all of these domains. And these pillars are that there are the pillar of situational intelligence, situational readiness, and situational fluency. All are important to drive agility into the position. So situational intelligence means assessing and making sense of the situation you're facing, whether that's your enemy, if you're a fighter pilot, whether that's your competitor or your buyer, if you're a seller, whether it's the patient that you're encountering as a first responder. So the first task or the first pillar is situational intelligence, which is about assessing the situation you're facing. Then situational readiness, which is about determining the best path or best course of action given the situation you face. And then situational fluency, being able to execute the actions that you've selected and then monitor impact. There's a very well-known fighter pilot named John Boyd who developed a method of doing this, of this situational intelligence, situational readiness, and situational fluency, and monitoring the results, called the OODA loop. And if you're interested in learning more about this, you can look up John Boyd. You can learn all about his OODA loop. But it's a decision-making framework that fighter pilots use to, not get shot down, basically. And although sales, isn't quite that risky, we still have to understand our situation, determine the best course of action, execute that action, and then monitor results. When we take a look at all of this research and then these three pillars of agility outside of the sales domain, they really form the pillars of agility within the sales domain. So basically what happens is there's a framework for organizational agility where the manager assesses progress, aligns sales activities to results, coaches to those activities, and continues to assess progress, and on it goes. There's situational sales agility where the sellers and managers assess the buying situation, choose from amongst multiple strategies, execute those tactics, and monitor buyer reactions. And then there's this level of foundational agility where if sellers understand the buying journey and the psychology behind the buying journey, they understand how buyers flex across that journey, they can then choose how they can flex across that journey and execute the relevant approach and monitor buyer reactions. So what happens when sellers and managers behave in ways that reflect this level of agility? Well, what happens is you see results like these: 35% more sellers at quota, 20% more revenue per seller, 30% increase in average selling price. And these are not isolated metrics. These are just examples of metrics that organizations that implement agility enjoy. So what can you do with this information? How can you get more information? We have a white paper, The Bottom Line on Sales Agility, Separating Fact from Fiction, which is a much deeper dive into what I just covered in this webinar. We're also very excited to announce that McGraw-Hill is publishing our third book, The Sales Agility Code, in April of 2023. Some of the key takeaways from our session today, hopefully that you will walk away with: Agile development does not equal sales agility. It's a very clever perspective, but not really commensurate. The buying journey is a piece of the agility puzzle, not the entire picture. Consultative selling is foundational to other forms of agility. And the good news is agility can be trained. So what can you do as a follow-up to this webinar? You can reach out to us and request a copy of our white paper. We'd be more than happy to send it to you. You can watch a video about situational awareness and situational fluency on YouTube. And you can contact me. So that's what I've got, Angelica. Why don't we see if we have any questions that I can answer?
Thank you, Michelle. That was awesome. I'm looking at the Q&A panel and it doesn't look like there are any questions. Again, if you have any questions with Michelle, now's the time. You have her here live. She can answer it live. But yeah, definitely thank you so much for the amazing content and the
Sure.
slides.
Would you
Super
like for me to bring up one of the common questions?
Sure. Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, one of the most common questions that we get when we talk about sales agility with our clients and prospects is, I can't even get my salespeople to use one approach. Now you're telling me they need to use 4. And that seems like an almost impossible task. And what we know from doing this now for many years is that most sales methodologies, especially that are sort of a one-size-fits-all, they're very highly over-engineered. And they're designed to be able to work in almost any circumstance, which means they don't work well in any circumstance. So when you take a look at the framework for situational agility, it's actually simpler and less complex than a single sales methodology that you've likely encountered in the past. So it's not just about understanding different paths, it's about boiling those paths down to the essence so that you give salespeople only what they need and no more. So that's one of the common questions that we get. Hopefully that was helpful.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'll definitely add that in the key takeaways along with all your notes in the deck, along with this recording. Super excited to hear about your new book coming next year. I'm sure the audience and our community is going to be so excited. So definitely stay tuned for that. Oh, it looks like we have a Q&A maybe. It looks like we have a video Q&A. Tom George, if you want to come on, I'm going to approve you.
Well, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
So I've tried submitting questions via the chat, and I tried submitting questions via Q&A, and it's not accepting my questions. So here I am. I'll do it verbally. So what's the value of a sales methodology? Are you suggesting that we shouldn't have a sales methodology?
Yeah, that's such a good question, Tom. Of course not. In fact, those organizations who have established consultative selling as their methodology have actually done themselves a favor, because consultative selling is really foundational to all these different levels of agility. So if you've done challenger sale, fantastic. If you've done consultative selling, great, right? If you've done value selling, great. What it means is that we now have a framework, Tom, for you to use to leverage prior investments or prior training that you've had in a sales methodology to not only understand when are they effective, but how are they effective? Because again, Tom, what we found is any one of these 4 approaches only work about 25 to 30% of the time. So are they useful? You bet they're useful. But sort of the next level up, Tom, in upskilling the sales force in sales agility is helping sellers understand, of the things that we've shared with you in the past, when are they applicable and when do they win?
Yeah.
Does that help?
Yeah. Well, just to follow on, I think what you're saying, or I'll tell you what I believe about methodology.
Okay, sure.
I'm not sure there's that much of a difference between spin or I think Challenger is the exception, but MedPick or whatever, it's really about value selling. It's really about consultative selling. Mm-hmm. And I think what you're saying is that's a great foundation.
Yes.
I'll ask this. Do you need that before you start doing this agile selling?
You don't have to have a strong base of consultative selling, because you can learn consultative selling along with disruptive, competitive, and financial. However, if the training that you're receiving doesn't really dive into the buying journey and buyer psychology, it's going to be a little harder for you.
Right. Okay.
So that is the caveat that I'll give you. And a lot of consultative selling programs do not dive into buyer psychology. And that's what Gartner and Vantage Point have identified very recently as critical to this whole process of agility. So consultative selling, important. Buyer psychology, really important.
So can you tell me more about buyer psychology then? Because for me, the root of this is, what are the buyer needs, right? What are the pains? What are they trying to accomplish? Is there a difference between buyer need and buyer psychology?
Well, a buyer need is only one element. And so what we've also learned, and this is not research done by Vantage Point. This is actually research done by a guy named Daniel Kahneman. You might have heard from him. He won the Nobel Prize for economics. And what he found is that pain is a significantly stronger motivator than gain. And if you tie that to the buying journey and buyer psychology, buyers oftentimes don't even get into a buying process unless they have pain that's big enough to solve. But that pain really is only relevant mostly in the early part of their buying journey. Once they decide they want to make a change, their needs, their motivators, they shift. Their objectives, they shift. And so if your perspective is it's all about pain and you're encountering a buyer that's really late in their buying process, they've already managed to understand their pain. They've already decided it's big enough to fix. Now they're out there looking for solutions. Right. So if you want to encounter them very late in their buying process and you ask your 20 spin questions around problems and implications, you're not going to align very well to them. Right. So buyers start with pain, then they shift to gain, then they actually shift back to pain toward the end. So understanding how buyers navigate that journey and how their motivations and objectives change, it matters. Because it's the difference between, am I creating a positive, satisfying buying experience for you, my buyer, or am I just following my sales process? And that becomes obvious. Does that clarify that a little bit, Tom?
It does. I mean, I'd love to unpack that more, but that's fantastic.
Yeah. Well, buy our book, Tom. It's coming out in April.
How do I get the white paper? How do I get...
You can email us at info@VantagePoint Performance. You put out your information and we will send you that white paper.
Very good. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom, for coming on.
Great
another question.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, it looks like there's some technical difficulties with the Q&A. So if anyone is comfortable, you can have your camera off. Thank you, Tom, for being the first one to do that. If you have any questions, I can definitely, you can join and ask the question to Michelle. We actually do have a question in the Q&A. Yasir had said, do you think buyers are getting agile as well? What are your points of view on that?
Well, buyers are getting very agile. In fact, they're getting a lot more organized and discerning than they've ever been in the past. And this is kind of problematic because buyers are less available than they've ever been, and they require a higher level of tailoring than they've ever required in the past because of their personal buying experiences. So there's no way the buyers are not agile when you think about how your personal buying experiences are impacting your professional and business buying experiences. So absolutely they are. And in the book on sales agility that we're writing, the Sales Agility Code, the entire book is from the perspective of the buyer. So understanding how buyers are agile, why they're agile, and what it means to sellers, you can understand that a little bit more both in the white paper and in the book, but it's a great question. The answer is yes.
Yes, the answer is yes. Thank you so much. And again, all of Michelle's, there looks like another chat. Jeff asked, Michelle, I look forward to diving deeper into the subject with your recommended resources. Thank you, Jeff. We will have all the resources that Michelle provided on the MSP website along with her contact information. So if you do want to get your copy of her book that's coming out next year or get put on the wait list, we'll definitely have that information on the website as well. We're super excited to read more about it. Any more questions, either on the chat, Q&A, or video that anyone wants to come on stage with us? Michelle is a wealth of knowledge, so she's here with us until the top of the hour. So if no one else has any questions, again, we'll provide her email, and she's really great on answering directly to you. So we'll provide that at the end of the day. And again, if you love Michelle's content, which I know you do, I'm going to drop the MSP Guide to Crushing Quota, all of Michelle's events with MSP on the chat. If it works, hopefully it works. This is all of Michelle's events with us. Yep, it works. Awesome. So definitely click there and look at all her past events with us if you haven't done so already. And then at the end of the day, again, this event along with her deck and resources will be on that page as well. But Michelle, thank you again. You have been amazing as always. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Sorry that there has been technical difficulties in the chat, but we'll see you next time. Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much. Bye, everyone.